Okinawa by Susumu Higa. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that terribly. This is a new book out, published by Fantagraphics. It's a dirty book. It's only small. You know, it's like kind of below digest sized. But it's really well made, in fairness. Lovely kind of cover, lovely everything. But enough about that. The book, the story itself, looks at Okinawa in a very intriguing, interesting way that I don't think I've read another book that talks about a place and approaches it in the same way that this book does. This collection split into two, really. It's two books collected into one, and I think it was originally published around the 1990s, somewhere in there. And essentially the first book is called Sword of Sand and the second book is called Mabui. Sword of Sand starts off very much in kind of World War II era, looking at the Japanese coming to the island and making it a strategic kind of stronghold against the impending Pacific War that's coming down on all areas in that part of the world. And so simply a boat arrives on one of the many islands around Okinawa, because Okinawa is made up of not just one island but lots of smaller islands as well. And so the Japanese forces come ashore and they basically tell the townspeople, tell the villagers there that they're taking over the islands of Okinawa, and it will be the last battleground of the Pacific War. Now, the people there have been quite lucky in many ways that they hadn't been necessarily directly involved in warfare up to that point, but a lot of the kind of villages and people and the whole communities are then kind of repurposed as a battleground, essentially. You know, their homes and their towns and areas are now being fortified and they're going to fight against it. And so this first story arc really delves into the impact of these armed forces from Japan coming in and essentially, you know, taking down trees, taking down areas, making changes without consulting anyone, and really impacting on the whole of the community there, and then them trying to fight against it. Now, you would be forgiven thinking when you start this book that it is a non-fiction book, but it's not. It's actually a skillful combination of fiction and non-fiction. So what the author and artist have done is he's intertwined a lot of stories that he's found in newspapers, found in articles, found in historic records, and not only that, his own family history, his own personal experiences of life on the island and living there with the language and the culture and the religion. He's interwoven all of these things. Both book one and book two are both made up of a combination of short stories, but none of those short stories are necessarily non-fiction stories, and they're not necessarily fiction stories either. They're very much this creation to give a feel and an indication of what Okinawa was like during this period, how this process of people coming into the island affected people living there, how they interacted with the forces coming in. And it really does that well, I think. It's the one thing I got from both book one and book two collected here, is I understood kind of what it would be like to be part of that community in Okinawa and empathize with them on these forces coming in, both American and Japanese. And the initial book of Sword in the Sand goes through the Japanese coming, goes through the Americans then fighting back and fighting the Battle of Okinawa and the death toll that that would bring. And then the aftermath as well, when people were kind of surrendering, hiding out in temples. All the while, though, you find out about different religious ceremonies and the culture and the language of the people on Okinawa. And one of my favourite stories of this initial one is actually called School, and that's a brilliant one because essentially they are digging, you know, areas, you know, to hide out in and to, you know, strategic trenches and caves and stuff like that. And they come across buried records and books under one of the main palaces on Okinawa. And these books kind of are so delicate that being exposed to the air kind of turns them into fragments, really. They disappear. And so a school teacher employs several students to come and to record these books, because they're a history that if they're gone and it's a part of their culture. And so the whole story is them actively trying to fight against saving and preserving their heritage and their culture. And it really does sum up this first book, I think, that it is showing how Okinawa's culture and creativity and their whole artistry and their religion and everything is being threatened by military forces coming in, and not just the Japanese but the Americans who would later occupy the islands as well. Is their way of life is being threatened, and that's what this book does expertly well, I think, is it showcases how damaging this kind of military occupation and warfare is to communities and to cultures and to pasts and futures. And it really does highlight how badly Okinawa has suffered, you know, in terms of its culture and its land. The second book decides to focus much more on the American occupation of the lands in the aftermath of World War II. There's a little bit of that in the first book and a little bit of that future foretelling in the first book, but it really delves deep into that more modern times after World War II in the second book, how people occupy and live around these bases and the amount of American bases that are on these islands, and how financially the communities have become dependent on the military forces, but equally how restrictive they become and how much of an occupying force they become, really. It's very interesting. The second book decides to focus quite squarely on the religious beliefs and traditions of the people of Okinawa, and you get really in depth into how they view the world and how they view sacred spaces and things like that. Like they've got Ugan is an area that is a religious area, and then they have Uta, which is kind of like medium or shaman and that type of thing, and they are focused heavily on this second book because it's giving you an idea of what the cultural and religious beliefs are of this area and how the occupying forces are almost preventing them from doing their traditional beliefs and purifying fields and purifying areas and going into, you know, sacred spaces on their island to perform different ugans and rituals. The book really focuses heavily on that, but it also doesn't shy away from the fact that people on those islands, native to those islands, are benefiting financially in a big way. And so it almost shows that the community itself is divided between whether it should go financially or it should hold those old traditions tightly and cultivate them and make sure they live on. And so it very much kind of gives a balanced argument towards cultural life in Okinawa, but it very much is like the first story, and a combination of ideas and stories, not necessarily fiction, not necessarily non-fiction. It bridges this gap in between. It's very much taking the experiences and lived in histories of the author and putting them against other bits of history, but equally taking those to different directions and different places and exploring what it is like to live on Okinawa with the military bases and how they coexist with each other or don't coexist with each other. The artwork, which I haven't touched upon, is really simplistic and straightforward, but is always quite pleasing as well. It sometimes is extremely good. The characterizations on the faces and everything like that, I don't think the artwork is necessarily going to be to everyone's taste, but equally, I quite enjoy this simplistic approach to artwork. It's similar in many ways to Shirgei Mizuki's work in terms of the characters themselves are full of emotion and full of life, but the backgrounds are far more detailed than the people and the humans. And I don't think that's a bad thing at all. But it certainly goes places that you wouldn't expect to go. Like there's stories on clay manufacturers and potters, and there's stories on the Utah, the shaman and things like that. And there's loads of different unexpected short stories in both book one and book two, but you certainly finish it with a feel more than anything, an idea of what life in Okinawa was during World War II, the aftermath, and now going into the modern day. And to a certain degree, that's what this book wants to do. It doesn't want to give you answers because there are no answers really. You know, it's an ongoing process and an ongoing fight. And yeah, you might have an opinion against the military bases or for the military bases. It's a difficult political situation. It's a difficult community situation. There's lots of people thinking lots of different things and having lots of different experiences. But this book really showcases Okinawa in a very interesting, intriguing way, I think. And I haven't quite read a look at a place quite like this book, and I certainly think it's worth a read, definitely, particularly if you're interested in, you know, how cultures develop and the things that affect them, and different political problems, you know, spanning in the aftermath of occupation and things like that. But ultimately, I think it is well worth a read. I enjoyed it. I don't know whether I'll kind of delve back into it soon, but I'm certainly going to keep it on my shelf and pick it back up again in future, because I reckon there's probably certain bits that I missed or overlooked that I got to delve back into. But yeah, that is my opinion on Okinawa. Thank you very much for watching, and I will catch you on the next one.